Hello, Ubaldo Acosta greets you again. I hope you're ready to start with this lesson. We're going to study the subject of constructors in Java. Are you ready? Let's go. Constructors in Java. It can be very tedious to initialize the variables of a class each time we create an object. For it, Java allows you to add values to the objects from the moment of their creation. This concept is known as constructor, and basically, it is a method, but it will allow us to create an object with the values that we provide when creating our object. The constructors, although very similar to the methods, have certain differences and characteristics, such as these constructors can only be executed at the time of creation of an object. It's not possible to use them later. The constructors don't return any value. The name of the constructor is identical to the name of the class. This is how we can identify if a class has constructors, always respecting the case sensitive. By default in Java, a constructor without arguments is created, known as an empty constructor. This empty constructor is added automatically by the compiler, but if we define a constructor other than the empty constructor, that is with arguments, then the Java compiler no longer adds an empty constructor to our class, and it's our responsibility to add the empty constructor to our class if necessary. In the figure, we can see an example of our arithmetic class, using the empty constructor and another non-empty constructor to create our objects. Suppose we have two attributes in our class, of the integer type, called a and b. In the first case, we're creating an object by calling the empty constructor. Therefore, the values of our attributes are initialized, with the default values according to the type of each attribute. If it's a primitive type, they are initialized according to their default values. And if they are of type object, remember that the default value is null. On the other hand, we create an arithmetic object but with initial values from the moment we are creating the respective object. So we are sending the values of 5 and 10 respectively. And therefore, we can take these values to initialize the attributes of our classes. Constructors example. General form of a Java constructor. Remember that a constructor has the same name of the class. So for declaring a constructor, we must use the name of the class, and we can pass arguments to this constructor. After that, we have the body of this constructor. Example of constructors in Java. Constructor without arguments. So we define the arithmetic constructor without arguments, and we have the constructor body. But also we can have a constructor, for example, with two arguments. So we define a constructor but passing two arguments. We also have the constructor body, and we close this constructor body. As we have said, a constructor initializes an object at the moment of creation. It's also responsible for reserving the memory for the creation of the object. To create a constructor in Java, the general syntax includes the name of the class. In this way, we can identify if a class has a constructor or not. Prior to this, it may or may not have an access modifier such as public or private. These modifiers will be studied in detail later. After the name of the class, similar to a method, it may or may not have arguments. Remember that Java creates the constructor without arguments automatically. However, if we have added a constructor with arguments, then Java will no longer add this constructor for us, and it's our responsibility to add it if we are going to need it. In fact, for good practice, we should always use the empty constructor. In Java, when we create two or more methods with the same name, this feature is known as overloading. This means that we can create two or more options when creating an object to use these methods. This means that we can create two or more options for the methods in order to use them. As we observed in the example, we have added two constructors to the arithmetic class. In the first case, it's the empty constructor or without arguments, This constructor can optionally have a code when created the object, even if it doesn't receive arguments. Secondly, we have a constructor with 2 arguments, and it receives 2 arguments of type integer. Once we receive the argument, we will normally use them to initialize our attributes of the class. This is what we will put into practice in the following exercise. Finally, it should be mentioned that a constructor, unlike a method, does not return any value. Therefore, we will not find the word return nor a return type in the signature of the constructor. This is because what a constructor returns is the object itself. It means a reference to the object.